This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The town of Clearwater Beach, Florida was a serene coastal haven known for its white sands, turquoise waters, and friendly small-town charm. Life moved at an unhurried pace here, where residents greeted each other by name, and the town's greatest excitement was the annual New Year's Eve celebration. It was a place where tragedy seemed unthinkable, and the very air carried the warmth of familiarity. Amid this tranquil backdrop lived Annabelle Carter, a 15-year-old whose quiet existence blended seamlessly into the background. Annabelle was a girl you might pass on the street without a second thought. Her slight frame, pale complexion, and perpetually downcast eyes gave her an air of invisibility. She was the type of student teachers often forgot to call on and classmates overlooked. Annabelle spent her school days at Clearwater High, where she sat at the farthest corner of classrooms, her face hidden behind a curtain of dark, unkempt hair. Her grades were average, her participation minimal, and her friendships non-existent. At home, Annabelle's life was equally unremarkable. She lived with her mother, a weary woman who worked 2 jobs and came home too exhausted to notice her daughter's growing silence. Her father had left years earlier, his absence a scar Annabelle never spoke of but carried deeply. Their small apartment was cluttered with unpaid bills and the echoes of conversations that never happened. Annabelle's world was one of solitude, punctuated by the muffled sounds of her mother's television late at night and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Yet, beneath this mundane exterior, Annabelle's mind was anything but quiet. Her thoughts were a labyrinth of frustration, pain, and an insatiable curiosity about the darkest corners of human behavior. She found solace in her sketchbook, filling its pages with detailed drawings of macabre scenes, shadowy figures, jagged weapons, and faces twisted in terror. Art was her escape, a silent scream she could control. Her fascination with true crime began innocently enough, with documentaries and podcasts. Over time, it grew into an obsession. She scoured online forums and read every detail of infamous cases, piecing together the lives of both victims and perpetrators. Annabelle felt a chilling kinship with the latter. Annabelle's room was her sanctuary, a space she had transformed into a reflection of her inner world. The walls were bare save for a few taped-up sketches, but the clutter on her desk told a different story. There were books about criminal psychology, articles printed from the internet, and notes scribbled in the margins. She often stayed up late, her face lit by the cold glow of her laptop screen as she disappeared down rabbit holes of violent histories and unexplained mysteries. She was drawn not only to the acts themselves but to the intricacies of planning, the precision, and the aftermath. It was as though she were studying a science no one else cared to understand. At school, Annabelle's isolation only deepened. She was a target for ridicule. Her thrift store clothes, her withdrawn nature, and her refusal to engage made her an easy mark. Some students were cruel outright, calling her names or knocking her books to the floor. Others dismissed her with the indifference that stung just as much. Teachers, burdened with classrooms full of more demanding students, saw Annabelle's silence as compliance rather than a cry for help. Day after day, she walked the halls like a ghost, unseen and unheard, while resentment simmered beneath her surface. It wasn't that Annabelle didn't want to connect, she simply didn't know how. When she tried to speak, her words felt clumsy and inadequate. The more she failed, the more she withdrew. In her darkest moments, she convinced herself that she was invisible because she was meant to be. But those same moments were when her imagination offered her a twisted comfort. In her mind, she began to create scenarios where she wasn't powerless, where her name would never be forgotten. The seeds of violence were planted in those quiet hours, though Annabelle herself couldn't yet see it. Her thoughts grew darker as she internalized the pain inflicted on her. She started to imagine what it would feel like to fight back, not just against her bullies, but against the entire world that had turned its back on her. She fantasized about the shock on their faces, the fear in their eyes. It wasn't just revenge she craved, it was recognition. As the holiday season approached, the atmosphere in Clearwater Beach became festive, with twinkling lights strung across palm trees and the scent of salt air mingling with cinnamon and pine. But for Annabelle, the season only highlighted her isolation. She watched classmates exchange gifts, laugh in tight-knit groups, and make plans for the New Year's Eve celebration. She knew she wouldn't be invited. She never was. The weight of exclusion settled heavily on her shoulders, pressing her further into the darkness she had come to know so well. Annabelle's descent into the abyss was gradual, a series of small steps that seemed innocuous to the outside world. But within her, a storm was brewing. Every insult, every dismissal, and every missed opportunity became fuel for a fire she could no longer control. By the time New Year's Eve arrived, Annabelle had become a stranger even to herself, her quiet world transformed into something menacing and unpredictable. The weeks leading up to Christmas in Clearwater Beach were alive with festivities. The streets were strung with lights, wreaths adorned shop windows, and the town square was transformed into a winter wonderland, complete with an enormous artificial tree. For most, it was a time of joy and community, but for Annabelle Carter, it was a season that underscored her isolation. She wandered the halls of Clearwater High watching her peers prepare for the holiday talent show and exchange Secret Santa gifts, all while she was invisible, as usual. The event that would change everything began innocuously enough: a routine school assembly in the gymnasium. The holiday talent show was the centerpiece of the celebration, an annual tradition where students performed music, dances, and skits. It was a spectacle the entire school looked forward to, and Annabelle, as always, sat in the farthest corner of the bleachers, trying to blend into the shadows. She was not a participant. She had no close friends to cheer for, no role in the festive chaos. She simply observed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes scanning the stage without truly seeing it. During the talent show, a group of her classmates performed a comedic skit meant to parody different students and teachers. Annabelle hadn't expected to be included. Why would she be? She was practically a ghost. But halfway through the performance, her name was mentioned. The group mimicked her hunched posture, her quietness, and the way she always seemed to disappear in the crowd. They exaggerated her awkward movements, her unkempt hair, and her thrift store clothes, making her the punchline of a joke that filled the gym with laughter. The laughter was deafening. Annabelle felt it like a physical blow, each chuckle and guffaw stripping away a layer of her already fragile sense of self. Her chest tightened as the heat of humiliation crept up her neck. She could feel the eyes of hundreds of students and teachers on her, some openly staring, others trying to stifle their laughter. Even the few who didn't laugh offered no solace. Their silence was worse, a tacit approval of the cruelty unfolding on stage. When the assembly ended, Annabelle hurried out of the gym, her head down, trying to escape before anyone could say anything. Her heart pounded as she shoved open the heavy double doors and stepped into the cool December air. The laughter still rang in her ears, a cruel soundtrack that played on a loop. She thought she was alone, but a group of girls caught up to her near the parking lot. They were laughing, repeating lines from the skit, and making mocking comments about her appearance. One of them snapped a photo of her as she turned away, shouting that it would make a hilarious meme. Annabelle clenched her fists so tightly that her nails bit into her palms, but she said nothing. She never said anything. That night, Annabelle sat alone in her room, replaying the day over and over in her mind. The humiliation festered, twisting into anger and resentment. She stared at herself in the mirror, her reflection warped by her tears. Every insult, every laugh, every mocking glance seemed to echo inside her head. She wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat, trapped by years of learned silence. Instead, she picked up her sketchbook and began to draw. The lines on the page were jagged and violent, transforming into a scene of chaos and destruction. It was the first time her art felt like more than an outlet, it felt like a plan. The following days didn't bring relief. The photo taken in the parking lot was posted on social media with a cruel caption, and the comments that followed were equally vicious. Annabelle's humiliation spread beyond the walls of the school, becoming a source of entertainment for people she didn't even know. Each notification, each snide comment, each mocking emoji chipped away at what little sense of normalcy she had left. Her teachers didn't notice her withdrawal, they never had. Her mother, overworked and preoccupied, didn't ask why Annabelle was coming home later or spending more time in her room. The isolation that had once been her shield now became her cage, and inside it, her thoughts grew darker. The world had pushed her into a corner, and she began to believe there was only one way out. One afternoon, while scrolling through the comments on the post about her, Annabelle came across a link to an online forum. It was a space where anonymous users discussed violence, revenge, and justice as if they were interchangeable. At first, she was horrified by what she read, but as the days passed, she found herself returning to the site. The stories shared there mirrored the feelings she had buried deep within herself: anger, betrayal, and the desperate need to be seen. It was on that forum that she found the spark for her plan, ideas whispered to her through the cold glow of her screen. The final breaking point came at the school's Christmas party. Annabelle had been required to attend, even though she knew it would be another exercise in exclusion. As she stood awkwardly by the refreshment table, a boy walked by and deliberately knocked over a cup of punch, spilling it onto her shirt. The laughter that followed was the last straw. Something inside her snapped. In that moment, Annabelle felt the weight of every insult, every slight, and every moment of humiliation. She didn't cry this time. She didn't run away. She simply stood there, staring at the boy until he turned and walked off. That night, she returned to her room and opened her sketchbook once more. This time, she didn't stop drawing until the early hours of the morning. By the time she closed the book, she had outlined everything. Her humiliation would not go unanswered. They had laughed at her for the last time. The plan took shape slowly, born from the depths of Annabelle's growing despair and rage. It was not a momentary impulse, but a deliberate, methodical process that consumed her every waking thought. As Christmas decorations in Clearwater Beach gave way to New Year's banners and fireworks stands, Annabelle became a shadow moving through the town, her mind working tirelessly to turn her pain into something unstoppable. She began by studying the annual New Year's Eve celebration. The event was the pride of the town, a gathering that brought together nearly every resident for a night of music, food, and fireworks. The main square, flanked by local shops and cafes, became the hub of activity, with a stage for performances at one end and rows of food trucks and vendor stalls lining the streets. A countdown clock was prominently displayed, and at midnight, fireworks illuminated the night sky in a dazzling spectacle. Annabelle had attended the celebration before, though always on the periphery, unnoticed and uninvited to join the groups of laughing friends and families. This year, she would be at the center, and everyone would notice her. The first step was gathering materials. Annabelle's room became a hidden arsenal, her art desk transformed into a workspace for destruction. She scoured online forums for information, sifting through posts and videos about crafting weapons and explosives. The anonymity of the internet offered her a veil of safety, and she absorbed the knowledge with a cold, detached focus. She used her mother's credit card to order supplies, ensuring the packages arrived when her mother was at work. Annabelle's careful planning went unnoticed after all. Her mother rarely ventured into her room, and the boxes blended in with the clutter of teenage life. Annabelle's sketchbook, once filled with artistic expressions of her emotions, became a chilling blueprint. She drew detailed maps of the town square, noting every entrance, exit, and choke point. She studied the layout of vendor stalls and stages from previous years, cross-referencing them with photos she found on social media. Her drawings were meticulous, each line and symbol representing hours of planning. She marked where crowds would be densest, where police would likely be stationed, and the best places to create chaos. Every contingency was considered, every potential flaw in her plan accounted for. Her preparations extended beyond the physical. Annabelle began to condition herself mentally for what she was about to do. She spent hours watching videos of past tragedies, focusing not on the horror but on the execution. She read manifestos, searching for threads of justification that resonated with her own anger and despair. She found a twisted sense of solidarity in the stories of others who had reached their breaking points. They had acted, taken control, made themselves impossible to ignore. She would do the same. In the weeks leading up to New Year's Eve, Annabelle's behavior at school became almost robotic. She attended classes without speaking, her eyes dull and unfocused. Teachers noted her increasing withdrawal, but chalked it up to the typical struggles of adolescence. Her classmates, still riding the high of their holiday teasing, didn't notice the change in her demeanor. If anything, they were relieved that she had become even quieter, less of a presence in their lives. No one saw the storm gathering beneath the surface. The most difficult part of Annabelle's plan was the timing. She knew the exact moment she wanted to strike when the crowd's attention would be fixed on the countdown to midnight. It was a moment of collective excitement, when people were most vulnerable. But to ensure everything went according to plan, she had to test her preparations. A week before the event, she conducted a series of dry runs. Late at night, when the town square was empty, she walked the routes she had mapped, counting her steps and memorizing the locations of cameras and escape routes. She tested the timing of her makeshift devices in an abandoned lot on the edge of town, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and exhilaration as each small explosion confirmed her calculations. Annabelle's final preparations involved her appearance. She didn't want to be immediately recognizable, at least not until it was too late. She purchased a mask from a local costume shop, a bright, festive design that would blend in with the celebratory atmosphere. It was a stark contrast to her usual unassuming wardrobe, but it served her purpose. The mask would hide her face, allowing her to move through the crowd unnoticed until the moment she revealed herself. On the day of the event, Annabelle woke early, her body tense with anticipation. She went through her checklist one final time, her hands trembling slightly as she secured each item in her bag. She avoided looking at herself in the mirror. afraid that her reflection might betray a flicker of doubt. Instead, she focused on the image in her mind, the moment when everything would change, when the laughter and whispers would finally be silenced. As the sun set over Clearwater Beach, the town square came alive with music and laughter. Families gathered to watch performances on the stage, teenagers roamed in packs, and vendors called out to passers-by, their stalls filled with hot food and sparkling trinkets. Annabelle arrived early, blending into the crowd with her mask firmly in place. She moved through the square like a ghost, unnoticed and unremarkable. The energy of the celebration buzzed around her, but she felt detached, as though watching it all from behind a pane of glass. She positioned herself near the center of the square, where the crowd would be thickest as midnight approached. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her mind was clear. She checked her watch, counting down the minutes until the countdown began. The bag at her feet felt impossibly heavy, its contents a tangible reminder of what she was about to do. For a moment, a sliver of doubt crept in, but she pushed it aside. This was her moment, the culmination of weeks of planning and years of pain. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Annabelle took a deep breath and reached for the first device in her bag. The crowd around her was oblivious, their attention fixed on the stage where the mayor was delivering a cheerful speech. Annabelle's fingers trembled slightly as she activated the device, but her resolve remained firm. She had spent her entire life being invisible, but tonight she would be impossible to ignore. New Year's Eve in Clearwater Beach was a spectacle of joy and tradition. Every year, residents and visitors gathered in the town square to welcome the coming year with fireworks, music, and camaraderie. Vendors sold snacks and drinks, children played games, and laughter echoed through the streets. It was the kind of event that embodied the small-town charm of Clearwater Beach, a celebration that people looked forward to for months. The entire community was there that night, blissfully unaware that this year's celebration would end in unspeakable tragedy. Annabelle Carter had spent weeks meticulously preparing for this night. She had blended into the crowds during the days leading up to the event, studying the layout of the square, noting the positions of exits and the placement of barriers. She observed how the crowd moved, how the vendors set up their booths, and where the local police stationed themselves. She used this knowledge to finalize her plan, her mind calculating and detached, driven by a single purpose. The night began like any other New Year's Eve. Annabelle arrived early, carrying a large backpack that blended in among the other bags people brought to carry picnic blankets or snacks. Her clothing was unremarkable, chosen specifically to avoid drawing attention, a simple black hoodie and jeans. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her face partially obscured by a festive mask. The mask, adorned with sequins and feathers, was a common sight that night, part of the town's tradition of masquerade-themed celebrations. No one noticed her, just as they hadn't noticed her all her life. Annabelle's first target was the main stage, where a local band was performing upbeat covers of pop songs. The area was packed with people swaying to the music and cheering. She had stashed a homemade explosive device beneath the stage earlier in the evening, concealed inside a discarded amplifier case. It wasn't sophisticated, but it didn't need to be. As the band played their final song, Annabelle slipped away, her heart pounding as she moved to a safe distance. The explosion that followed ripped through the air, silencing the music in an instant and replacing it with screams. Flames and smoke engulfed the stage, and the crowd surged in panic, pressing against each other in a desperate attempt to flee. The chaos was exactly what Annabelle had anticipated. She moved through the crowd with unnerving calm, her backpack now lighter as she discarded items one by one. From a side pocket, she pulled out a firearm, purchased illegally online and modified using instructions she had found on the dark web. She had practiced with it in the abandoned lot behind her apartment complex, the recoil and sound becoming familiar over weeks of preparation. She began firing into the crowd with calculated precision, aiming not at random but at clusters of people where her bullets would cause the most damage. Screams erupted as people dropped to the ground, some injured, others dead. The festive lights strung across the square flickered, casting eerie shadows over the carnage. Annabelle's mask concealed her expression, but her movements were methodical, almost mechanical. Each shot was deliberate, her finger steady on the trigger as she moved through the chaos. The crowd fractured, splitting into smaller groups that ran in every direction. Annabelle anticipated this. She had planted smoke bombs in key locations to disorient people further, choking the air and reducing visibility. The acrid smell of burning chemicals mixed with the scent of spilled drinks and blood, creating a nightmarish atmosphere. Parents screamed for their children, friends searched for each other, and people tripped over fallen bodies in their desperate attempts to escape. Police officers on duty tried to respond, but they were unprepared for the scale of the attack. Annabelle had studied their patterns and knew exactly when and where they would be stationed. She avoided them at first, keeping to areas where their presence was weakest. When she finally encountered resistance, she was ready. She hurled small incendiary devices, Molotov cocktails crafted with glass bottles and gasoline, toward the police vehicles, forcing officers to retreat and regroup. The fire spread quickly, casting a hellish glow over the square and adding to the chaos. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Annabelle's spree continued. She moved toward the food stalls, where families had gathered earlier to enjoy funnel cakes and cotton candy. The area was now a scene of devastation, with overturned tables and spilled food littering the ground. Annabelle's footsteps crunched on broken glass as she fired again, her targets now indistinguishable in the smoky haze. The sound of her weapon echoed against the walls of nearby buildings, mingling with the wails of the injured and dying. Despite the chaos, Annabelle remained eerily composed. She had prepared herself for this, numbing her emotions through relentless visualization of the act. She wasn't driven by a blind rage, but by a cold, calculated sense of purpose. Each action was part of her plan, each step a piece of the puzzle she had spent weeks assembling. She wanted to be remembered, not as the quiet girl who faded into the background, but as a force that couldn't be ignored. As the first responders arrived, ambulances, fire trucks, and additional police units, the scene became even more chaotic. Annabelle knew her time was running out. She retreated toward one of the alleyways she had marked on her map, a narrow path that led to the edge of town. Along the way, she discarded her mask, her hoodie now streaked with soot and blood. The sound of sirens grew louder, and she could hear the shouts of officers coordinating their efforts to secure the area. She had planned for an escape, but deep down, she knew it was unlikely. She didn't care. She had already accomplished what she set out to do. By the time the authorities cornered her near an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the square, the death toll had risen to 56, with dozens more injured. The massacre had left the town square in ruins, a place once filled with joy now stained with terror and grief. Annabelle surrendered without resistance, her weapon discarded at her feet. Her expression was unreadable as the police cuffed her and led her away, her face illuminated by the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. The night of horror ended in silence. The once lively square now eerily quiet, except for the distant crackle of dying flames. Families mourned their loved ones, survivors clung to each other, and the small town of Clearwater Beach was left in the grip of a tragedy that would haunt it forever. Annabelle Carter, the quiet girl no one had noticed, had made sure her name would never be forgotten. The aftermath of the New Year's Eve massacre in Clearwater Beach was a storm of chaos, grief, and unanswered questions. By the time Annabelle Carter was apprehended in the early hours of January 1st, the once celebratory town square had been transformed into a scene of devastation. The bodies of 56 victims, ranging from children to the elderly, lay amid the debris of the celebration, overturned tables, deflated balloons, and charred remnants of decorations. Dozens more were injured, many fighting for their lives in local hospitals. The small Florida town, once known for its quiet charm, became the epicenter of one of the most horrifying mass killings in American history. Annabelle's capture was oddly anticlimactic. She didn't resist the police, who found her slumped against the wall of an abandoned warehouse, her face streaked with soot and blood. Her weapon lay discarded a few feet away, and her empty hands were raised in surrender. Her expression was devoid of emotion, her eyes hollow, as though the carnage she had unleashed had drained her of everything she had. The officers were prepared for a fight, but instead they found a 15-year-old girl who seemed disturbingly calm for someone who had just committed an act of unprecedented violence. The media descended on Clearwater Beach within hours, turning the town into a circus of flashing cameras, news vans, and endless speculation. The headlines were "Relentless Teenage Killer Slaughters 56 in New Year's Eve Massacre, the Monster Behind the Mask," and "What Drove Annabelle Carter to Murder." Her mugshot, featuring her pale, emotionless face and hollow eyes, became an indelible image across television screens and front pages. Commentators debated everything from her motivations to the failures of the systems that should have protected her and her victims. In the days following the massacre, the focus shifted to uncovering who Annabelle Carter was and why she had done what she did. Investigators combed through her home, her school, and her digital life, piecing together the puzzle of her troubled existence. Her small bedroom became a chilling exhibit of her descent into darkness. Sketchbooks filled with violent images, printed articles about infamous mass killers, and hand-drawn maps of the town square were all laid out for the world to see. The evidence left no doubt that her attack had been meticulously planned. Psychologists and criminologists weighed in, each offering their theories. Some argued that she was a product of neglect and bullying, her actions a tragic consequence of a society that failed to notice her pain. Others dismissed this as an excuse, framing her as a cold-blooded killer who had chosen to act out her violent fantasies. The debate raged on, but the one person who could have provided answers, Annabelle herself, remained silent. She refused to speak to investigators, her public defender, or even the judge during her initial court appearances. Her silence became a haunting question mark hanging over the entire case. The trial, when it finally began, was a spectacle of epic proportions. The courtroom overflowed with reporters, family members of the victims, and legal experts eager to witness the proceedings. Annabelle, now dressed in an orange jumpsuit, sat stoically at the defense table, her face betraying no emotion. The prosecution painted her as a calculating and remorseless murderer, presenting her detailed plans and the horrific aftermath of her actions as evidence of her intent. Witnesses recounted the terror of that night, their voices breaking as they described the chaos and loss. The defense, led by a court-appointed attorney, faced an uphill battle. They argued that Annabelle was a victim of her circumstances, a teenager driven to the brink by years of neglect, bullying, and untreated mental health issues. Expert witnesses testified about her psychological state, citing her obsession with violence as a manifestation of deeper issues. The defense pushed for her to be tried as a minor, emphasizing her age and the systemic failures that had contributed to her state of mind. However, the brutality of her actions and the calculated nature of her plan made it difficult for many to view her as anything other than a monster. The trial dragged on for months, a painful and polarizing experience for the town and the nation. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, with some calling for justice for the victims and others advocating for understanding and reform. Social media exploded with hashtags, think pieces, and heated arguments. The trial became more than just a question of Annabelle's guilt. It became a referendum on gun control, mental health care, and the treatment of young offenders in America. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense and often unbearable. Family members of the victims broke down on the stand, their grief palpable as they recounted the lives that had been stolen. Survivors of the massacre described their physical and emotional scars, their words heavy with trauma. Annabelle sat through it all, her gaze fixed on some distant point, her expression unchanging. Her refusal to engage, to show any sign of remorse or explanation, infuriated some and baffled others. The prosecution sought the harshest punishment possible, arguing that the severity of her crimes warranted her being tried and sentenced as an adult. They described her as a ticking time bomb who had methodically planned to cause maximum devastation, a predator who deserved no leniency. The defense countered with pleas for rehabilitation, citing her youth and the possibility of redemption. They portrayed her as a broken child not beyond saving, who had been failed by every system meant to protect her. The jury deliberated for days, their decision weighed down by the enormity of the case. In the end, Annabelle was found guilty on all counts, 56 counts of first-degree murder, dozens of counts of attempted murder, and charges related to terrorism and weapons violations. The judge, citing the unprecedented nature of her crimes, sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted with mixed reactions, tears of relief from the victims' families, anger from those who believed she should have faced the death penalty, and quiet dismay from those who had hoped for mercy. As Annabelle was led away in handcuffs, the cameras captured her one final time. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable, before disappearing from view. Her silence remained unbroken, leaving the world to grapple with the meaning of her actions and the legacy of her violence. For Clearwater Beach, the trial's conclusion was not an end, but the beginning of a long, painful recovery. Memorials were erected for the victims, their names etched in stone as a reminder of the lives lost. Survivors and families sought solace in each other, forming support groups and advocating for changes to prevent such tragedies from happening again. The town, once a symbol of idyllic coastal life, became synonymous with one of the darkest chapters in modern history. Annabelle Carter's story left behind more questions than answers, her motives forever shrouded in mystery. Her name became a grim shorthand for a broken system, a cautionary tale that forced the nation to confront its own failures. The courtroom may have delivered its verdict, but the wounds she inflicted, both physical and emotional, would take far longer to heal. Clearwater Beach was never the same after the New Year's Eve massacre. The town that once embodied coastal serenity, with its sparkling waters and sun-drenched streets, became a place overshadowed by tragedy. In the weeks following the attack, the festive decorations that had once symbolized joy were hastily removed, leaving the streets bare and somber. The square, once the heart of the town's celebrations, was cordoned off, a crime scene that no one wanted to revisit. The silence that hung over Clearwater Beach was not the peaceful quiet of its former days, but a heavy, oppressive stillness born of grief and trauma. The physical scars of that night were soon eclipsed by the emotional ones. For the families of the 56 victims, life would never return to normal. Parents mourned children who would never come home. Siblings grew up with empty places at the dinner table, and friends grappled with the absence of those they had laughed with only hours before the massacre. Funerals became a grim routine, the sound of tolling bells echoing through the town almost daily in January. Entire families moved away, unable to bear the weight of their loss in a place that had become a constant reminder of their pain. For the survivors, the wounds went beyond the physical. The injured carried scars that told a story they wished they could forget. Those who escaped unharmed were haunted by survivors' guilt, replaying the events of that night in their minds, wondering why they had been spared when so many others had not. Children who had once felt safe playing in the streets now clung to their parents, their laughter replaced by anxiety. The adults, too, found themselves jumping at loud noises or looking over their shoulders in crowds. Clearwater Beach, a town that had prided itself on its sense of community, became a place where fear lingered in every corner. As the town struggled to process its collective trauma, the rest of the nation watched. News outlets continued to run stories about the massacre, keeping Clearwater Beach in the public eye for months. Experts descended on the town, offering opinions on everything from gun control to mental health reform. Activists used the tragedy as a rallying cry for their causes, while conspiracy theorists spun their own narratives, blaming everyone from shadowy government agencies to social media algorithms. The people of Clearwater Beach found themselves unwilling participants in a national debate, their personal grief reduced to headlines and sound bites. Despite the overwhelming sorrow, the town began to rebuild. A memorial was erected in the square, replacing the stage where the first explosion had gone off. A simple design was chosen: a circular fountain, surrounded by 56 plaques, each bearing the name of a victim. At the center of the fountain stood a single flame, designed to burn eternally as a symbol of remembrance. The memorial became a gathering place for those seeking solace, a quiet space where people could leave flowers, notes, and tokens of love for the lives lost. The massacre also sparked significant changes in how the town approached safety. The annual New Year's Eve celebration was permanently canceled, replaced by smaller, private gatherings in homes and churches. The local police force underwent extensive retraining, and new security measures were implemented for public events, including metal detectors, bag checks, and surveillance cameras. These changes brought a sense of security to some, but others felt they were a reminder of what had been lost: a carefree way of life that could never be reclaimed. In the years that followed, the massacre left its mark on every aspect of life in Clearwater Beach. Schools introduced anti-bullying programs and expanded mental health services, a direct response to the revelations about Annabelle Carter's troubled history. Teachers received training on how to recognize signs of distress in students, and counselors were made available to both children and staff. These measures, while praised by many, came too late for those whose lives had already been shattered. Annabelle's name became a subject of controversy. Some believed it should never be spoken again, that she should be erased from the town's history as a way of honoring the victims. Others argued that ignoring her story would mean ignoring the warning signs that had led to the tragedy. A debate over how to teach the massacre's history in schools highlighted the divide. Ultimately, the decision was made to include it as part of the high school curriculum, framed as a cautionary tale about the consequences of neglect and unchecked violence. The massacre also inspired activism among those most affected by it. Family members of the victims formed organizations to advocate for change, focusing on issues like gun control, mental health reform, and the regulation of online spaces. Survivors spoke at conferences and rallies, sharing their stories in the hope of preventing future tragedies. Clearwater Beach became an unlikely symbol of resilience, its name evoking not just sorrow but a determination to ensure that such an atrocity would never happen again. Over time, the town began to heal, though the process was slow and uneven. New businesses opened, bringing fresh faces to the area. Tourists returned, drawn by the beach's natural beauty, though they often approached the town with a sense of reverence. For the residents, life carried on in fits and starts, moments of normalcy interrupted by sudden waves of grief. Anniversaries of the massacre were particularly painful, marked by memorial services and candlelight vigils. Each year, the eternal flame in the square burned a little brighter, its reflection shimmering in the tearful eyes of those who gathered to remember. Clearwater Beach's legacy became one of duality, a town defined by its darkest day, but also by its efforts to move forward. The massacre left scars that would never fully heal, but it also inspired profound change, both within the community and beyond. The people of Clearwater Beach carried the weight of their loss with quiet dignity, their lives forever shaped by the events of that fateful night. Though the town could never return to what it once was, it found a new identity in its resilience, a testament to the strength of a community determined to honor its past while forging a future free from the shadows of its tragedy.